What if the galaxy's most dangerous weapon wasn't a bomb or a battleship, but a broken girl who learned how to love again? They called her a living Cursion alien queen whose touch could incinerate cities, hunted across star systems, betrayed by her own blood, doomed to ignite anyone who dared hold her. Until one human reckless, wounded, and completely unarmed reached out anyway. Now, with the Empire closing in and the stars burning behind them, one kiss could spark the next rebellion or end them both in fire. And just before her skin should have scorched his alive, it didn't. He didn't flinch. She didn't burn. And for the first time in her life, she hoped. Keep watching, because what happens next changes everything. The twin moons hung heavy and low, bleeding silver light across the jagged arches of the Grand Tribunal arena. Their glow carved ghostly shadows on the golden sand, where centuries of blood had already soaked beneath thousands of feet. The crowd was a living beast tonight, snarling and howling in one unified cry for pain. Every breath, every chant, every pounding fist on stone echoed like a war drum through the bones of the capital. She stood alone in the center, barefooted and bound, her violet skin marked with ancient sigils of her people sigils that glowed faintly under the twin moons, pulsing like a heartbeat refusing to surrender. Her back was straight, shoulders square, chin tilted, not in arrogance, but in refusal. Not once did she lower her gaze to the sand. She stared forward, past the crowd, past the guards, past the execution platform, as if daring the stars themselves to blink first. Commander Zayn's voice cracked across the amphitheater like thunder over brittle glass. Today, the accused will not burn for treason, nor for her whispered alliances. Today, she burns for the audacity of being born what she is. The crowd roared with approval. High in the shaded columns above, hidden among engineers and vendors, Ethan Wren stood frozen. His disguise as a utility technician had always worked before. Never questioned, never challenged. But now, all that faded into noise. Because their center stage was the woman he had seen in the back alleys near the quarantine districts. She hadn't begged when their eyes met. She hadn't run. She had stared into him like she could peel back every lie he wore and see the man hiding beneath it. The crowd screamed, again chanting now, a rolling, hungry rhythm. Light her! Light her! Light her! The executioners stepped forward. They carried the ceremonial pious crystalline rods that would channel heat from the moons above and ignite her from the inside. A death not of flame, but of internal combustion, precise, efficient, unrelenting. Ethan's breath stopped in his chest, not because of fear, but because somewhere inside, something cracked open. Something old, something human. He stepped forward. I invoke Directive 7A of the Coalition Accords. It wasn't a shout, it was a voice that cut, clean, sharp, impossible to ignore. The entire arena fell into silence and not the hush of reverence, but of disbelief. Even the moons seemed to pause in orbit. Commander Zayn turned, slow and deliberate, eyes narrowing beneath the black shimmer of his command helm. Repeat that. Ethan's voice didn't shake. Directive 7A, Sanctuary Clause, Ancient Coalition Law. The right to intervene in sovereign execution proceedings under witness appeal. Zayn's mouth twisted. That law hasn't been cited in over 2 centuries. Still binding, Ethan replied, stepping into the light. Unless you wish to challenge the Accords publicly before 3 moons and 10,000 witnesses. There was a long, tense silence. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't boo. They stared, as if trying to decide whether this Terran was foolish or something more dangerous. Zayn finally nodded. Very well, the Terran claims responsibility. The life of the prisoner is now his burden. Should she commit another act of rebellion, both shall die. The bindings released with a hiss of plasma. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't move. She simply looked at Ethan, eyes like violet storms, and asked softly, as if the entire galaxy hadn't just tilted. Why? Ethan offered her his hand. Because no one should die for being who they are. And in that moment, when her fingers touched his palm, something unseen passed between them. Not a bond, not yet, but the ignition of something far more volatile. And high above, in the shadowed control towers of the tribunal, someone watched the scene with a different kind of silence. Calculated, cold. Because saving her had just triggered something they could no longer control. The chains hissed as they fell, leaving faint red marks wrapped like ghosts around Leora's wrists. She didn't flinch. The way she looked at Ethan wasn't gratitude, it was fury veiled in silence. Her violet eyes cut through him like twin blades drawn under starlight. Her presence was commanding, yet haunted, as though she carried the weight of every lost scream from a fallen world. "You couldn't let them do this?" Her voice was sharp, accented with a strange elegance, roughened only by weeks, maybe months of captivity. "You just signed your death warrant, Taryn." Ethan didn't back down. His voice was low, steady, as if he'd already accepted the noose. "That makes two of us." A tremor of murmurs rippled through the crowd as guards stepped back, some with expressions like they just witnessed a crime more blasphemous than murder. Commander Zion's lip curled in disdain, but his posture stayed rigid. He gestured once, curt and final. 6 hours, he said. "You leave Caloris Prime by the Nor, you'll both be hunted. And believe me, there won't be a second ceremony." The moment the decree was issued, the sky shifted. You could feel it like the air itself had changed its allegiance. Banners that once danced in the wind seemed to wilt. The light from the moons grew colder. And the crowd, once hungry for blood, had quieted, not with satisfaction, but uncertainty. The gates opened, and Leora stepped down beside Ethan, moving like a creature unused to freedom. She walked tall, but her muscles coiled, tight as tripwire. Every step was wary, every breath calculated. Outside the arena, the streets were less alive, but no less dangerous. High towers loomed like watchful beasts, casting long shadows across the dark stone roads. Above, the sky cracked with the soft hum of orbital drones taking new Orders Imperial war commands written in silence. Leora turned to Ethan, her expression unreadable. "Do you know what you've done?" He nodded once. "Yeah." "You don't." She stopped beneath a flickering archway etched in old rebel script words long outlawed. "They won't just come for me now. They'll come for anyone who speaks your name. You think this was noble? It was foolish. I've been called worse." "You've been many things," she muttered, almost to herself. "But you've never been hunted by an empire with nothing left to lose." For a heartbeat, there was silence between them. Then, softer, she added, "Why did you really do it?" Ethan didn't answer right away. The wind carried the scent of scorched dust and metal, what the city always smelled like after a public execution. He looked at her, not as an alien, not as a threat, but as someone standing on the very edge of extinction, refusing to fall. "Because I've seen death in many forms," he said, "but I've never seen someone so ready to face it, and so undeserving of it." She held his gaze, and something flickered behind her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but a crack in the wall. They moved fast through side alleys and service lifts, slipping between zones like shadows wearing borrowed skin. Word was already spreading. 2 fugitives, 1 human, 1 fireborn. 5,000 credits each, dead or alive. More if the human was brought in alive for questioning. In the lower districts, the whispers had teeth. Old traders turned their heads. Enforcers clutched their rifles tighter. Even the city itself seemed to pulse with silent alarm streets narrowing, exits shifting, like the infrastructure conspired to trap them. They ducked into a storage tunnel carved beneath the old Magtram line. Leora leaned against a rusted beam, breathing slower now. Ethan stood a few paces away, hands in his coat pockets. "You don't know what I am," she said, the words more statement than warning. "No," Ethan said, "but I want to. That's dangerous. So is living." She almost smiled but didn't. Instead, she rolled her shoulder, where faint golden scars glimmered like dormant lightning under her skin. He noticed, but said nothing. "I used to believe that if I hid long enough, they'd forget I ever existed," she said. "Turns out I'm harder to erase than they expected." Ethan studied her carefully. "You're not a secret. You're a message they couldn't silence." She looked at him, then really looked. Something passed between them, quiet but heavy, like the hush before the breach of storm doors. "They'll come for us," she said. "Let them." A distant siren cried out somewhere in the upper blocks. The hunt had begun, but they were already moving, vanishing into the city's metal veins. Together, the city beneath the city was alive in a way the world above had long forgotten. Steel ribs twisted overhead like the bones of something ancient, rusted pipes hissed with chemical breath, and the air hung thick with a sour mix of ozone, coolant, and ash. Down here, no one smiled. No one asked questions. If you were in the Undercity, you were either running from something or hunting it. They didn't speak at first. Breaths came too hard, too fast. The hum of tracking drones echoed from somewhere far behind, robotic wings slicing through the corridors of gas and grit. Leora's footsteps, light and precise, never faltered, even barefoot against broken steel grates. She moved like someone born for war, but molded by exile. Ethan led without hesitation. He knew these tunnels, had repaired their power cores, rerouted their heat systems, patched their failing fans. He'd lived in this decay long enough to know where the cracks led. Left turn past the graffiti-scorched water main, right into the abandoned coolant duct, down 3 levels where the air turned sulfuric and the sensors didn't work. He didn't need maps, he needed instinct. She followed, not because she trusted him, but because she didn't have another option. Behind them, static crackled over patrol comms. Visual lock, quadrant 7, possible signature match. Adjust flight path, order confirmed. Terminate if resisted. They ran faster. At one junction, they nearly collided with a service droid still dragging a leaking container of irradiated fuel. It didn't react. The city had seen worse than fugitives. They ducked into a tram tunnel, pitch black except for the faint glow from the scars beneath Leora's skin. Gold, faint, pulsing. Ethan glanced at them, but said nothing. Then, her voice broke the silence quiet, but sharp enough to cut. Why would a human risk his life for me? He kept running, ducked under a low beam, and then said, "Because you look like you still had something to fight for." She didn't answer, but her pace quickened. They turned again, descended a collapsed stairwell, crawled through a half-closed blast door, and emerged into a maintenance shaft swallowed by dust. Light flickered at the far end, dim, blinking green. The hangar. Ethan hit a panel on the side wall. A code long forgotten blinked red once, then turned green with a mechanical sigh. The door slid open. Stale air poured out, mingled with the scent of old fuel and oxidized coolant. Inside, in the far corner of the hangar, draped beneath a tarp of stitched panels and carbon fiber sheets, sat a forgotten shuttle low profile, engine cowlings scorched from past escapes, cockpit glass cracked but intact, the kind of ship that shouldn't fly, and yet, somehow, did. Leora stepped inside the hangar and paused, her eyes adjusting. The moment stretched. This place, how long has it been abandoned? Ethan touched the hull of the shuttle like greeting an old friend. 10 months. I did a refit on it, added some stealth mods before the owner vanished. Guess he didn't need it anymore. She walked toward the ship, her fingers trailing along its side. It's ugly. It's alive, Ethan said. That's better. A low vibration shook the far wall. Not thunder footsteps. Heavy, mechanical, organized. The drones had found the entrance. Leora turned to Ethan, her voice sharper now. How fast can you make it fly? He smiled, the kind of smile you wear when you know you're not dead yet. Depends how fast you can trust me. She narrowed her eyes, then, almost reluctantly, nodded. Then get in. They sprinted toward the shuttle. Ethan powered up the console. Lights sputtered. The engine gave a reluctant growl, then steadied like a breathing beast waking from slumber. Outside the hangar doors, metal scraped against metal. The drones were cutting their way in. Leora took the co-pilot seat, scanning controls she recognized but didn't quite trust. Give me thruster override and shield dampeners. I'll handle lift. You focus on nav sync and power routing. Ethan glanced at her. You know how to fly? I was born above the clouds. The hangar doors exploded inward, fire blooming like a mechanical sunrise. But the ship was already rising, already shifting sideways, rotating, humming with life. Drones opened fire. The shuttle banked hard, scraping against the hangar's edge as it burst into the Undercity's upper flight corridor, weaving between support pillars and abandoned cargo skiffs. Laser fire streaked past them, blinding pulses that lit the dark in staccato flashes. Leora gritted her teeth. I hope you have a destination. I hope you have patience, Ethan replied, flipping 3 switches in sequence. We'll need to steal one. The city fell away behind them, shrinking into a speck of fire and shadow. Ahead, open sky or what passed for it. A storm dome cracked above, parting just long enough for them to rise through the breach. No alarms yet. No planetary defense fire. But they both knew it wouldn't last. Inside the cockpit, sweat beaded down Ethan's temple. He could feel her watching him. Not hostile, not trusting, something in between. Like a blade testing its sheath. Then she spoke again, quieter this time. They'll come after you harder now. You understand that, don't you? I didn't plan to live forever. A silence passed between them. That wasn't silence at all. It was the beginning of something neither of them had the words to name. Not yet. There was a silence between them, not comfortable, not cold, but charged. Like the air just before lightning chooses where to fall. The kind of silence that breathes, that presses against your skin from the inside out. Ethan sat across from her on the edge of a rust-streaked storage crate inside the shuttle's dim rear hold, its walls humming softly with residual power. The storm outside had passed, but something heavier was building inside the cabin. Leora sat hunched over, clutching her side, her breath shallow, quiet. The fabric of her jacket had burned through during the escape, and beneath it, Ethan could see them markings, gold and alive, shifting in patterns like liquid circuitry just beneath her skin. They pulsed, slow at first, then brighter when his eyes lingered too long. "You're hurt," he said softly, taking a knee. She didn't move. "Let me look," he continued, reaching for the edge of her sleeve. Her voice cracked through the air like a whip. "Don't." He froze. She straightened, eyes hard, glowing faintly like embers beneath violet glass. "Do not touch me when I feel weak." Ethan pulled back, hands open, unthreatening. "All right, okay. I just thought..." "You thought I was like you." The way she said it wasn't cruel. It was raw, a truth peeled from the bone. She stood slowly, hands trembling despite the fire in her voice. "My kind. When we're vulnerable, when fear or pain gets too close, our bodies react. They ignite." Ethan looked at the glowing trails under her skin again, and suddenly, the pulsing light wasn't beautiful anymore. It was a warning. A language of survival carved into her very biology. She exhaled through her nose, shaking. "We don't control it. It's not magic. It's not rage. It's evolution. A defense mechanism bred into us by centuries of war. A final answer to danger, to touch, to love." He didn't speak, didn't move. Just watched her unravel something she had never said out loud in front of anyone still breathing. "You want to help me?" she asked, voice low, cracking. "You want to be near me, protect me? You don't know what that means." Her hands opened, and Ethan saw tiny flares of heat rising from her fingertips. Not flame, just distortion, like the shimmer off hot pavement. She clenched her fists, and they vanished. "I've burned people who meant well. People who tried to get close. People I didn't want to lose." The words scraped against her throat as she said them. "There's no cure, no safe word, no shielding. If I lose control, I don't melt down, I become fire." Ethan leaned forward, not reckless, not bold, but with the patience of someone who'd seen too many things fall apart too fast. "You think that scares me?" Leora met his eyes, not with challenge, with disbelief. "Everything scares you," she whispered. "Not you," he said. She turned away, hand gripping the cold metal rail beside her. The tension in her back gave her away. She wanted to believe him. She just didn't know how. "You're not listening," she said, quieter now. "This isn't some curse with a poetic fix. I'm not broken in a way that can be kissed better." Ethan stepped closer, carefully, letting the space between them remain sacred. "I'm not trying to fix you." "Then what?" "I'm trying to understand what the universe would fear so much," it tried to erase. Her laugh was bitter, but there was water behind it. "It's not fear, it's control. They couldn't control us, so they called us dangerous, unstable, disposable." He nodded slowly. "And you survived." She turned again, slower this time. Her eyes weren't glowing now. They were tired, old, barely. The markings on her arms dimmed, like a storm moving off into distant sky. Ethan gestured toward the medkit beside him. "If I don't touch you, will you let me help?" She hesitated. He opened the kit, laid the supplies out between them without crossing that invisible line. Leora lowered herself to the floor, her back against the wall. For the first time, she allowed her jacket to slide down her arm, revealing the wound deep, charred along the edge, surrounded by skin that shimmered with an unnatural glow. But beneath that glow, she bled like anyone else. Ethan handed her the tools, one at a time, and watched as she treated herself. Her hands were steady now, more precise than he expected. It wasn't the first time she'd done this, not by a long shot. "You asked me earlier why I did it," he said. She didn't answer, focused on cleaning the wound. "It wasn't just because I thought you could still fight," he continued. "It was because when I saw you, I realized something." Her eyes flicked to him. "I've spent so long pretending to survive, I forgot what it looked like when someone still wanted to live." Leora didn't speak. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the ship shifted into power conservation mode, casting shadows across her face that danced like smoke. "You don't have to say anything," he added. "I just needed you to know that I don't want you to burn alone." She blinked once, slow and deliberate. Her lips parted slightly as if to speak, but she stopped herself. Then she said something he didn't expect. "Neither do I." He found her standing alone near the edge of the viewport, where the stars looked close enough to reach through glass and steel. Her arms were crossed over her chest, not in defiance this time, but in something quieter, something breaking. The shimmer beneath her skin had dulled, like fire that had run out of oxygen but refused to die. Ethan didn't speak right away. He knew the weight that silence could carry, how sometimes presence meant more than words. She didn't acknowledge him, not until the reflection of his movement flickered across the glass. "Isn't it beautiful?" she said, not looking at him. "How peaceful everything looks from far enough away. You'd never guess how many planets are burning beneath that quiet." He stepped closer. "Which one was yours?" Her shoulders tightened, just slightly. "Kes Lunari, fourth moon of the Theron arc. It doesn't exist anymore." He waited. She turned, leaning back against the glass now, her eyes never quite meeting his. "The Empire labeled us unstable. Too dangerous, too volatile. Said our biology was a threat to galactic order. So they did what all empires do when they're afraid. They erased." He could hear the restraint in her voice, like she'd practiced saying it without emotion, like she'd made the mistake of feeling too many times before and didn't want to make it again. "I wasn't just a soldier. I wasn't even a rebel. I was born into the Ember bloodline, royalty." She laughed bitterly, like the word tasted like ash. "My bloodline carried the purest expression of our kind's gift or curse, depending on who's telling the story." Ethan moved beside her but kept his distance. "That why they hunted you?" She nodded once. "I was the last one outside the blast radius when they struck. A diplomatic mission, ironically, trying to prove we weren't monsters. I watched my world go dark from the viewport of an ambassador ship too far to return." Her gaze finally met his. "I survived because I was absent, not brave, not strong, just gone." The weight of it sank in slowly. He saw it in the corners of her eyes, in the way her fingers curled like she still felt fire dancing along her bones. He whispered, "That doesn't make you dangerous, that makes you surviving." Her expression changed. Not soft, not hard, but haunted. "You don't understand. Then help me." She inhaled, steady but fragile. "He was the only one who tried. My fiancé, Kyle Tar. We were promised from childhood. Our union was meant to heal the wounds between clans, to end centuries of blood feuds. He believed in the old legend about the one person whose presence could silence the fire." Her voice dropped. "He held me when I was unraveling. He said it didn't matter, that if I burned, he'd burn with me." Ethan knew the ending before she spoke it, but the way she said it still cracked the air. "He didn't burn with me, he burned alone." She looked down at her hands, now pulsing softly beneath the skin, threads of gold flickering like dying starlight. "He died screaming, and I lived with the sound of it stitched into every breath I've taken since." Ethan's breath caught, not from fear but from the rawness of what stood in front of him. She wasn't myth, she wasn't weapon. She was guilt wrapped in beauty and flame, a soul still on fire beneath layers of scars. She looked at him now, fully, without barriers. "So you see, I'm not just surviving, I'm radioactive. A slow detonation waiting to happen. I don't get to love. I don't get to be touched. Not without consequence." He stepped forward, only a little. "And yet, here you are, still breathing, still fighting." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Not for myself." "Then for who?" "For whoever has the courage to try again." Ethan reached out, not touching. Not yet, but his voice met hers like a steady flame refusing to flicker. Then let me be the fool who tries. The markings beneath her skin sparked once, bright and angry, then calmed. And for the first time in years, she didn't pull away. The docking bay smelled of fuel and old metal, the kind of rot that seeps into your lungs and stains your clothes. Zarek's den hadn't changed, still cluttered with smuggled relics from dead planets and black market components stripped from ships no one was supposed to be flying. The old Trascan trader slithered forward from behind his reinforced desk, his 6 fingers twitching with a kind of practice welcome that only came from years of pretending to care. He grinned. If that thing he did with his lipless mouth could be called a grin. Leora Bextara, the Firechild returns, and with a Terran in tow no less. My. Desperation has made strange bedfellows. Leora didn't smile. We need transport off-world. Something fast, silent, clean. Zarek's gaze lingered on her a beat too long. And what's the urgency, princess? I thought the Empire already burned down everything you had left. Ethan didn't like the tone, but Leora didn't flinch. Her voice remained flat. You owe my family. I owed your mother, Zarex replied. But she's dead. And loyalty. Loyalty doesn't pay docking fees. There was something about the way he said it, too casual, too rehearsed. Ethan noticed the subtle glance Zarex gave to the security monitor mounted on the wall behind them. The way his fingers tapped a silent rhythm against the comm panel. Leora noticed it too. How much? She asked, not bothering to veil the contempt. He leaned in, voice slick. Enough to vanish. Enough to make the kind of life where no one asks your name. And you sold us for it, Ethan said, jaw tight. Zarek shrugged. You think I keep this place by making noble choices? The Empire pays more for traitors than they do for silence. And besides, your bounty came with incentives. The alarm didn't blare. It didn't need to. The power grid flickered. The pressure seals clicked. Doors began to lock behind them, one after another, until the only light in the room came from the flickering torches embedded in the bulkhead. Outside the reinforced window, silhouettes move Imperial hunters in black armor. Visors glowing red, rifles raised. Zarex took a step back. I made sure they'd take you alive, he offered, like it was mercy. Leora exhaled through her nose. Quiet, measured. Ethan looked at her. What now? She didn't answer with words. She raised her hand. And the temperature dropped before it rose. The markings under her skin pulsed once, twice, then exploded into radiant gold. The floor trembled, the air distorted. Ethan stumbled back instinctively, shielding his eyes as the fire ignited, not wild, not chaotic, but contained, controlled. And from that fire, shapes formed 2 figures, exact in form, made of flame and ash, standing where Leora and Ethan had stood seconds before. Zarex blinked. What is this? A message, Leora said, already pulling Ethan by the sleeve toward the maintenance chute hidden beneath a false floor plate. For the Empire. And for you. Zarex lunged to stop them, but it was too late. They vanished into the shaft, and the moment they disappeared, the fire clones collapsed. Not in silence, not cleanly. They detonated scorching flame that blackened the ceiling and turned the entire chamber into a tomb of smoke and static. When the trackers breached the main entrance, what they found was charred, remains unidentifiable, melted into slag, still glowing with heat. The sensors registered death, no life signs. Mission accomplished. Zarex, coughing and crawling from the corner, realized too late what had just happened. He had sold them for a future that now wouldn't arrive. And the Empire, true to habit, wouldn't stop to ask questions. A target was a target, a witness was a liability. Their weapons didn't hesitate. As the sound of pulse rifles cracked through the smoky den, far below in the underground tunnels, Leora and Ethan ran through flickering emergency lights and silence thick with secrets. She didn't look back. Ethan did. Not because he felt sorry for Zarex, but because he needed to remember exactly what betrayal looked like and how close it always stood. The cockpit hummed low, soft like a whisper held between breaths. Outside, stars drifted past in slow motion, endless and silent, a reminder of how small everything was and how quickly it could burn. Ethan sat in the co-pilot's chair, eyes locked on the nav readout, though he hadn't registered a single coordinate in the last 5 minutes. His mind was elsewhere, on her, on what she wasn't saying. Leora stood near the console, back to him, shoulders taut beneath her worn jacket. The glow under her skin had dulled again, but the air around her still crackled faintly, like a fire smothered but not dead. When she finally spoke, her voice didn't sound like hers. I wasn't arrested because I led an uprising. Ethan looked up, waited. She didn't turn around. There was no rebellion, no resistance cell. That was all. Noise. A cover. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. Then why? She touched a button on the console. A projection flickered to life. Not a map, not a star chart, a file. Old, fragmented, buried beneath Imperial encryption. She'd broken into a vault she was never supposed to reach. I found this in an Imperial archive beneath the Keslunari diplomatic station. A sealed campaign file marked Phase Echo. At first I thought it was another planetary deployment, but it wasn't. The file scrolled silently, names and designations flying past, followed by schematics, targeting grids, refugee camp layouts. It's a second wave, she said. Not against my people, against yours. Ethan stared at the data. The codes were real. He knew that encryption. The targeting systems matched civilian networks across 3 human colonies still standing. They're going to finish what they started, she said. The extermination of the Terra sector. Quiet. No tribunals, no broadcasts, just disappearances. He stood slowly. You risked everything? For us? Her shoulders finally dropped. A breath left her, too heavy to carry any longer. I did it because they are people. Because I know what it's like to have your world turn to ash and be told it was for the greater good. She turned to face him, eyes fierce but brimming. And because you looked at me like I was more than a monster. He took a step closer. Because you're not. Her jaw clenched, a muscle ticking under her skin. You don't know what I am. I know enough. No, you don't, she snapped, fire lighting faintly along her collarbone, golden veins threading across her arms like cracks in glass. I was born with the potential to ignite stars. To burn cities without lifting a hand. I was trained to suppress that until I wasn't. Ethan didn't move. You think this is about saving your people? About revenge number? It's about control. I'm the variable they couldn't predict. So they erased everything I loved and painted me a villain. And yet, Ethan said softly, you chose not to become one. She blinked once, slowly, as if the words hit something old and hollow inside her. I don't know what I'm becoming, she whispered. Not anymore. Then let me find out with you. He stepped closer. The fire under her skin flared. She didn't back away, but she didn't move forward either. Her breathing changed. The air between them tightened. You shouldn't say things like that, she warned. Why? Because if I believe you, I might let go. And if I let go, you burn. She nodded, barely. Their faces were close now. Too close, and yet neither moved. The tension between them had shifted into something raw and human and dangerous, in ways neither of them fully understood. He reached a hand halfway to hers but stopped just shy of touching. Her voice broke the stillness. I'm not ready. Ethan nodded, the motion small and aching. I'll wait. She turned away then, slowly, retreating into herself like a wounded star pulling gravity inward. And though nothing was said after that, everything between them had changed. Because trust had been given without touch, and in a universe that had tried to extinguish both of them, that was more powerful than any flame. Behind them, the data kept pulsing. The evidence, the truth. The reason the Empire feared her wasn't because she could burn them. It was because she'd chosen not to. Under the dim pulse of emergency lighting, the scout ship's interior trembled as engines cycled up from decades of disuse. Steel walls groaned. Heat bled from overworked conduits, casting flickers of orange across Leora's face as she stood silent, hands gripping the rusted edge of the command rail. Her breath steamed the air, not from cold but from the energy within her threatening to uncoil. Again, Ethan stepped into the glow beside her. He didn't speak at first. The silence had changed between them. It no longer held fear. It held potential. How does it work? He finally asked. This fire of yours. Is there any way it doesn't kill? Her eyes stayed fixed on the viewport. Stars blurred, time slipped. She didn't answer for a long moment. "There's a story," she said quietly. "An old tale whispered to young Emberbloods before the Empire turned our myths into warnings." He waited, watching her. "They say our fire knows the truth, that it cannot destroy what it fully understands, that when we find what is real truly, unshakably real, it surrenders." She turned to face him then, not with challenge, not with defiance, but something more dangerous: hope. "But legends lie," she said, voice breaking around the edges. "They're made to comfort the young and mislead the desperate. I've never seen it, never dared believe it could be more than a lie." Ethan stepped closer, slow, steady, never breaking her gaze. "Then let's find out." He raised his hand, not sudden, not forceful, just open. The way one would approach a creature half feral, half sacred. She flinched, but didn't move away. The markings along her arms lit veins of gold flaring to life, bright and violent. Heat surged between them like a furnace unbound. She gasped, chest tightening, body trembling not from pain but from the war inside her. "Stop," she whispered, eyes wide, terrified of herself. "I can't." But he didn't stop. His fingers reached hers. The fire flared. A ring of searing air erupted around them, then stuttered, then calmed. Like a tide drawing back, like breath after drowning. Leora stared down at their joined hands. The golden light danced across his skin and didn't burn. Her lips parted, disbelieving. "It doesn't hurt you." "It doesn't burn," he murmured. "Leora, it doesn't burn." Her hand gripped his knuckles white. Her eyes searched his, frantic, like she was trying to find the trick, the illusion, the cruel joke. But there was none, just warmth. And him, still standing, still holding her. "Then maybe," she whispered, voice cracking, "you are real." And when she kissed him, it was not gentle. It was not careful. It was the kiss of someone who had been locked away behind flame and myth and death for too long. Someone who had been waiting to prove a legend wrong just once. Her lips met his with heat, yes, but it did not scald. It pulsed. Their bodies pressed together, wrapped in an energy neither of them understood but both needed like breath. His arms slid around her, hers around him. Every spark between them begged to consume, but something ancient inside her shifted. The fire didn't lash out. It didn't rise in fury. It curled inward. It purred. The scout ship's systems whirred in the background. The stolen vessel didn't care about royalty or exile or myth. It only cared that it had a course plotted. And in the heart of that rusting shell, for the first time in years, Leora touched someone without killing. She felt warm hand, returned it. Not as a weapon, but as a woman. As something lost and found all at once. Outside, stars moved. Inside, hope did too. The silence before the strike is what chills the blood, not the noise of battle, but the quiet moments just before. When every gauge ticks steady and false security wraps around you like a soft lie. Then came the ping. Leora's head snapped toward the console. Her eyes narrowed. "We've been locked." Ethan glanced from the co-pilot seat, already strapped in, knuckles white on the armrest. "How many?" "3 interceptors, Imperial code marks, fast ones." Her fingers flew across the flight controls. "They'll be on us in less than 30 seconds. He tried to swallow, but his throat felt like sand. "You sure this rust bucket can outrun them?" She didn't answer. Instead, the ship groaned. The bulkhead screamed as Leora threw the scout craft into a tight spiral. The stars twisted outside the viewport, transforming into a dizzy smear as laser fire streaked across their path. The first blast hit their tail. A shudder rolled through the ship like a punch to the gut. Sparks danced from the ceiling, raining across Ethan's shoulder. "Shields down 10%, he shouted, reading the flickering readout. "I don't need you to narrate. Terran, strap in and override the rear stabilizer, unless you want to die passive and useless." That fire in her voice, it didn't scare him anymore. It grounded him. He leaned forward, typing commands with frantic fingers, hot air rushing around them as alarms howled. Stabilizer locked, recalibrating thrust vector. Outside, the void became a battlefield. The Imperial interceptors moved like shadows, fast and precise. They darted in like insects, trying to pierce the shuttle's underbelly, but Leora moved like she'd flown this chaos before. She banked left so sharply, Ethan thought the hull might split. Where the hell did you learn to fly like this? She grinned, teeth bared. My mother taught me, right before the Empire burned her alive. A second bolt grazed their right wing, searing metal and drawing another shower of sparks. Ethan's hand darted across the console. We've got one chance. If we hit the drift zone near the comet field, their sensors will scatter. Then pray to whatever gods you've got left, she muttered, and yanked the throttle to full. The ship screamed forward. They broke through the edge of the upper stratosphere, space swallowing them whole. But the Empire's reach was long. Too long. Another alert chimed. This one deeper. More urgent. We don't have time for subspace clearance, Ethan warned. They'll follow us into hyperspace unless... Unless they don't know where we're going, Leora said, reaching into the auxiliary nav feed. I'm wiping our signature. But the colonies... Her eyes locked onto his. No matter what happens, that message has to go. Ethan hesitated for only a breath, then nodded. He punched in the encrypted transmission codes, broadcasting directly to human relay points across the outer crescent. A warning graw and fast. The second purge was coming. As the ship jolted violently one last time, Leora slammed her hand on the hyperspace drive. A roar echoed through the vessel, as space folded around them like a scream swallowed by wind. And then silence. They were gone. But the message remained, floating through the dark between stars. A spark sent into the void. A rebellion waiting to ignite. Above a fractured moon cloaked in shifting auroras, the stolen scout ship floated in silence's scarred, scorched, but whole. The stars beyond shimmered like distant witnesses, their light touching the glass softly, like the hands of ghosts. Inside, everything was still. The hunt had ended. The escape had succeeded. And yet, neither Leora nor Ethan spoke for some time. She sat beside him now, not as a fugitive or a weapon, but simply as herself, Leora of Emberblood, last of her kind. Her skin no longer shimmered with chaotic fire, but pulsed gently with threads of gold like embers cradled in ash. The light was warm now, contained. Her breathing was steady. Her eyes, once wild with fury and grief, now held something far more dangerous hope. Ethan sat beside her, his hand folded around hers. The first time he touched her, it had nearly killed them both. Now his warmth met hers without fear. No armor, no hesitation. Only the shared silence of two people who had nothing left to run from. Leora exhaled. The words came not like confession, but revelation. You didn't just save me. He turned slightly, brows furrowing with quiet confusion. She kept her gaze on the stars beyond. You made me believe I was worth saving, she said. I've burned planets, killed people who love me. I thought I was fire given form meant to destroy, meant to be feared, meant to be erased. He said nothing, but his grip on her hand tightened. She continued, softer now. But you, human Terran, fool you, looked at me like I was still someone. Not a weapon, not a warning, a woman. Ethan's voice cracked through the stillness like a promise. The universe tried to turn your gift into a curse, he said. I just reminded you it was still yours. Her eyes welled not from sadness, but from the weight of something she'd never dared hope for. Acceptance. Outside, the hidden human colony below blinked its coded lights and underground sanctuary, untouched by Empire's eyes. They would descend soon. Begin again, but not as fugitives. As survivors, as believers. She leaned into him. The warmth between them no longer threatened to ignite the air. It soothed it. A fire finally understood. Her voice, when it returned, was a whisper laced with strength. If love is resistance, then I think I've been resisting extinction my whole life. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Because the most dangerous thing in the universe was not her fire. It was what it had become in his handsaw beacon. And in the vast dark, where empires ruled and rebellions died in silence, that small light between them undying, unstoppable, was already starting to burn. So in the end, it wasn't warships, plasma blades, or interstellar politics that saved her. It was something older than the stars. A hand held without fear. A fire that didn't kill. And a Terran who reminded the galaxy's most dangerous girl that she was more than her curse. She was love, wrapped in flame. And when she chose to burn for something instead of against everything, the Empire trembled. But this was never just their story. Because deep in the shadows of every dying star, There are more secrets, more rebels, more creatures who've been told they're unworthy of love, and more humans foolish enough to prove them wrong. Subscribe to Alien Chronicles, because out here, the truth isn't just stranger than fiction. It's the only thing worth fighting for. And this was only the beginning. See you in the next transmission.